The car spun on the ice before Claire Bennett even saw the curve coming. 1 second she was gripping the wheel, humming along to a song on the radio, and the next second, the whole world tilted sideways, and the headlights swept across black pine trees instead of black road. She heard herself scream. She felt the seatbelt bite into her chest. Then there was a jolt, a crunch of metal against a fence post, and silence. For a moment she just sat there, breathing hard, her heart slamming against her ribs. Snow was falling harder now, fat white flakes catching in the broken beam of one headlight. She tried the engine. It coughed once and died. She tried it again. Nothing. She was alone on a mountain road, in a storm that the radio had warned about all afternoon, and her phone showed no signal at all. Claire forced herself to think clearly. Panicking would not fix the car. She had a bag in the back seat, a flashlight in the glove box, and a memory of a paper map she had shoved into her coat pocket that morning, back when the whole trip still felt like a good idea. She was supposed to be renting a cabin for 4 quiet days alone. 4 days to think about the mess her life had become since her divorce. 4 days where nobody needed anything from her. Instead, she was going to freeze to death on a mountain road because she had trusted a weather forecast that said the storm would not arrive until night. It was already night, and the storm had arrived early. She grabbed her bag, zipped her coat to her chin, and stepped out into snow that was already past her ankles. The wind hit her like a wall. She turned on the flashlight and studied the map, or tried to, until the wind nearly tore it out of her hands. According to the map, the cabin she had booked was less than a mile up the road, past a bend and a small wooden bridge. A mile did not sound far. A mile in a blizzard, in the dark, on a twisted ankle she had not even noticed yet, because the cold was numbing everything, was a different matter entirely. She started walking anyway. What else was there to do? The wind screamed through the trees on either side of the road, and more than once she thought she heard something else underneath it, a low sound that was not the wind at all. She told herself it was her imagination. She told herself that mountains made strange noises when the temperature dropped, that ice cracking on branches could sound almost like breathing if you were frightened enough. She kept walking, one boot in front of the other, until her ankle throbbed with every step, and her lungs burned with the effort of pulling in air that felt more like knives than oxygen. When the cabin finally appeared through the trees, she almost cried with relief. A small dark shape with a steep roof, snow piling on the porch, a single window glowing faint and orange from what had to be a fire inside. Someone was already there. Probably the property manager, she told herself, checking that everything was ready before her arrival. She stumbled up the porch steps and pounded on the door with a fist that had gone almost too stiff to close properly. The door opened so fast that she staggered back in surprise. A man stood in the frame, tall, dark-haired, holding a splitting axe in one hand like he had grabbed the nearest thing he could find to defend himself. For one terrifying second, neither of them moved. Claire's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. The man's eyes were wide, his knuckles white around the axe handle, and for a heartbeat she was certain she had walked out of one danger and directly into another. Then he lowered the axe an inch, just an inch, and said, in a voice that shook slightly, that he had heard someone pounding through the storm and thought it was an animal trying to get in. Claire could not find any words at all. She simply stood there, snow melting off her shoulders, shivering so hard her teeth clattered together. He seemed to realize, all at once, what he was looking at. Not a threat. A frozen, terrified woman who had clearly walked through a blizzard to reach this door. He set the axe down against the wall, fast, like it embarrassed him to be holding it, and stepped back to let her in, saying something about a fire and dry blankets and asking if she was hurt. She was hurt. Her ankle had swollen inside her boot, and now that the adrenaline was fading, the pain rushed in all at once, sharp and hot. She limped past him, into the warmth of the cabin, and nearly went down before he caught her elbow and guided her to a chair by the fire. For a while neither of them spoke. He knelt and helped her out of her boot, wincing in sympathy at the swelling already darkening her ankle, then wrapped it with strips of cloth from a first aid kit that had clearly been stocked for far smaller emergencies than this one. Claire watched his hands work, steady and careful, and tried to slow her own breathing. When he finally introduced himself, his name was Nathan Hale, and he explained, in a voice still tight with the leftover fear of a moment ago, that he had booked this cabin for a week, to get away from the city, and finish some long overdue work on a project that had been falling apart around him. He had arrived that afternoon, before the worst of the storm, expecting to be completely alone. Claire told him her name, and that she had booked the very same cabin for the very same week, thinking she would have privacy and silence to sort out a life that felt like it was unraveling. They stared at each other for a long moment, the fire crackling between them, both trying to work out how a single reservation could belong to two different people. Nathan finally pulled out his phone, useless without signal, and admitted that he had gone through a rental agency he had never used before, a website with a name he barely remembered now, and that the confirmation email might have been a scam for all he knew. Claire felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the storm outside. If the booking had been a fraud, then this cabin technically belonged to neither of them, which meant, whatever was going on, they were both here uninvited, both stranded, and both about to find out that the real danger of that night had barely even started. Outside, past the frosted window, the wind rose to a new and higher pitch, carrying with it a sound that made both of them go still. It was not quite a howl and not quite a growl, but something that lived in the space between the two, low and rolling and far too close to the cabin walls. Nathan crossed the room without a word and checked the lock on the door. Claire watched him test the latch twice, then a third time, and understood, with a fresh wave of fear crawling up her spine, that whatever was out there in the dark had unsettled him just as badly as it had unsettled her. He told her, quietly, that he had heard that same sound twice already since he had arrived, once at dusk and once just before she knocked, and that both times it had sounded closer than before. Claire pulled her knees up toward her chest, ignoring the ache in her ankle, and asked him what he thought it was. He did not answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped low, as though he did not want whatever was outside to hear him guessing. He said the mountain had wolves, real ones, not the kind people saw on postcards, and that a pack driven down from higher elevation by a storm this bad would be hungry, desperate, and drawn to anything that smelled like shelter and warmth. As if the mountain itself wanted to prove him right, the sound came again, closer this time, and underneath it, unmistakable now, the soft crunch of something moving through snow just beyond the porch. Claire's pulse hammered so hard she could feel it behind her eyes. She looked at the axe leaning against the wall, then at the door, then at the single window with its thin pane of glass separating them from whatever was pacing outside in the dark. Nathan grabbed a chair and wedged it beneath the door handle, his movements quick and controlled in the way of someone forcing himself to stay calm. He told her they were safe inside, that the walls were solid, that wolves rarely tested a structure they could not immediately break into. Neither of them fully believed it, but saying it out loud seemed to matter anyway, the way a promise matters even when you are not entirely sure you can keep it. For the next hour they sat close to the fire, listening to the storm claw at the roof and the low, circling sound of something patient moving around the cabin's edges. Claire's ankle throbbed in time with her heartbeat. Nathan kept the axe within reach, though he never touched it again, as if having it nearby was enough to steady his nerves. At some point, worn thin by fear and cold and the sheer weight of a night that refused to end, Claire found herself talking, telling Nathan about the divorce, about the silence she had been chasing when she booked this cabin, about how she never expected silence to sound this loud. He listened without interrupting, and when she finally ran out of words, he told her, quietly, that he had come here running from something too, a failed project, a life that had stopped making sense somewhere along the way, though he did not go into detail, not yet. The wind screamed against the windows, the fire popped and hissed, and somewhere just beyond the frosted glass, something with a low and patient growl continued to circle the only shelter for miles, waiting for its chance. Claire realized, as she finally allowed her eyes to close from sheer exhaustion, that she had walked into that cabin expecting to find a week of solitude. Instead, she had found a stranger holding an axe, a storm that showed no sign of ending, and a sound outside the door that told her, without any doubt at all, that surviving the night was going to take everything both of them had. The fire cracked once, loudly, and Nathan's hand went instinctively to the axe handle again. Outside, the growling sound paused, as if listening back, and then, slowly, faded into the deeper howl of the wind. Neither of them slept that night. They simply sat together, backs to the fire, eyes on the door, waiting for whatever the storm had brought to the mountain to decide what it wanted to do next. Morning came gray and thin, filtered through clouds so heavy they seemed to sit right on top of the trees. Claire woke first, stiff from sleeping upright in a chair, her ankle throbbing with a dull, insistent pain that had grown worse overnight. Nathan was already awake, standing at the window, one hand pressed flat against the frosted glass as he studied the world outside. She asked him what he saw. He said the snow had not stopped, not for a second, and that somewhere beneath the fresh powder covering the porch, there were tracks. Large ones. He had counted at least 3 different sets circling the cabin at different distances, crossing and recrossing each other, like the animals had been testing the perimeter all night long, searching for a weakness they had not found. Claire pulled herself up, testing her weight on her injured ankle, and immediately regretted it. Nathan crossed the room fast enough to catch her before she went down again, his arm firm around her waist, his voice low and urgent as he told her to sit, to not push it, that a fall right now could turn a bad sprain into something far worse. She let him guide her back to the chair, embarrassed by how much she needed the help, and watched him kneel to check the swelling. It had darkened overnight, purple bleeding into the pale skin around her ankle bone, and when he pressed gently along the edge of the swelling, she gasped, despite herself. He told her, carefully, that it might not be a sprain at all. It might be a small fracture. Without an X-ray, there was no way to know for certain, but the swelling and the way she reacted to pressure worried him. The words landed heavier than the storm outside. A sprain healed. A fracture on a mountain with no phone signal, no working car, and a road buried under snow that showed no sign of stopping, was something else entirely. Claire forced herself to breathe evenly, to think past the fear climbing up her throat. She asked him what supplies the cabin actually had. Nathan walked her through it while he worked, restocking the fire with logs from a stack by the hearth. There was a pantry with canned soup, beans, some rice, enough to stretch across a week if they were careful. There was a woodpile outside that would need constant attention, since the storm was burning through their fuel faster than either of them liked. There was no radio that worked, no landline, and the generator in the shed outside had not turned over when he tried it the evening before. In other words, they were exactly as stranded as she had feared, and now she was stranded, with an injury that might be worse than either of them wanted to admit. They spent the morning taking stock of the small cabin, moving carefully around each other in the tight space, both trying not to acknowledge how strange it was to suddenly share a home with someone they had met less than 12 hours earlier. Nathan found extra blankets in a chest near the loft stairs. Claire, unable to do much with her ankle, sorted through the pantry from her chair, counting cans and doing quiet math in her head about how many meals they could stretch across 7 days, if the storm truly lasted that long. It was while she was moving a stack of old newspapers aside, looking for anything useful, that her fingers brushed against something tucked behind the pantry shelf, a small leather journal, worn soft at the corners, the pages inside filled with handwriting that grew increasingly uneven toward the back. She called Nathan over, and together they read the first few entries by the gray daylight through the window. The journal belonged to a man named Walter, the previous occupant of the cabin, according to the dates scrawled at the top of each entry. He had written about the mountain in the fall, about preparing for winter, about a storm that had trapped him, for what the entries described only as too long. The final entries were harder to read, the handwriting sliding sideways across the page, sentences trailing off mid-thought. Walter had written about sounds outside the cabin that would not stop, about tracks in the snow that circled closer every night, about a decision he had made that the last page never finished explaining. After that entry, the journal simply stopped. No explanation of what happened, no note about leaving the cabin, or being rescued, or anything at all. Claire looked up at Nathan and asked the question neither of them wanted to say out loud. What had happened to Walter? Nathan closed the journal slowly and set it on the table between them, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking toward the window, where the tracks in the snow were already being erased by fresh flakes. He said he did not know, but he said it in a voice that told her he was already imagining answers he did not want to share. The rest of the day passed in a strange, careful rhythm. Nathan went out twice to gather more wood, each trip shorter than the last, each time returning with his face pale and his breath coming fast, as though the mountain outside had grown more threatening in the short minutes he was away from the fire. Claire kept watch from the window during his trips, her heart in her throat every time he disappeared around the corner of the cabin, not fully breathing again until she saw him reappear. By evening, the growling had returned, closer than the night before, circling the cabin in a slow and deliberate pattern that made the hair on Claire's arms stand up every time it passed near the window. Nathan barred the door again, checked every latch twice, and pulled the small table in front of the window as an extra barrier, though both of them knew a table would do little against anything determined enough to break through the glass. They ate a quiet dinner of canned soup warmed over the fire, saying little, both listening more to the sounds outside than to each other. It was Claire who finally broke the silence, asking Nathan what exactly had happened to the project he mentioned the night before, the one he said had fallen apart and driven him out here in the first place. He hesitated for a long moment, poking at the fire with a stick, before he answered. He told her he had spent 2 years building a small business, something he had poured every bit of savings and energy into, only to watch it collapse in a matter of weeks, when a partner he trusted disappeared with the funds meant to keep it running. He had come to the cabin to figure out what came next, though so far, he admitted, the mountain had given him nothing but more problems to solve. Claire found herself telling him more too, filling the space between them with details she had not spoken aloud to anyone since the divorce was finalized, the slow unraveling of a marriage that had looked fine from the outside and had been hollow on the inside for years before it finally broke. Nathan listened the way he had the night before, without interrupting, without trying to fix anything, simply letting her talk until the words ran out on their own. It was strange, she thought, how easily the conversation moved between them, considering they had known each other for barely a day. Perhaps it was the fear outside pressing them together. Perhaps it was simply that two people running from very different kinds of loss recognized something familiar in each other. Whatever it was, it did not last long enough for either of them to examine it too closely, because a sound cut through the cabin that made them both freeze mid-sentence. Not a growl this time, not the low patient circling they had grown used to. This was sharper, closer, the unmistakable scrape of claws against wood, right at the base of the door. Nathan was on his feet instantly, grabbing the axe from where it leaned against the wall, positioning himself between Claire and the door. Claire pushed herself up despite the pain screaming through her ankle, backing toward the fireplace, grabbing the iron poker from its stand, because doing nothing felt more dangerous than doing something, even something useless. The scraping continued, low and steady, working at the wood near the bottom of the door frame. Then it stopped. A long silence followed, worse somehow than the noise itself, both of them straining to hear anything at all over the pounding of their own hearts. When the growl finally came again, it was not from the door, it was from the window on the far side of the room, and through the frosted glass, lit faintly by the firelight, Claire saw the outline of something large press itself against the pane, testing the glass with slow, deliberate pressure. Nathan swore under his breath and moved toward the window, axe raised, and for one terrible moment Claire thought the glass might actually give way. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shape pulled back, and the growling faded into the wind, retreating the way it had come. They stood frozen for a long time afterward, neither willing to be the first to move, both replaying the sound of claws on wood over and over in their minds. It was Nathan who finally spoke, his voice rough, asking Claire if she still believed this was only wolves. Claire did not answer right away. She was staring at the journal on the table, at Walter's uneven handwriting trailing off mid-sentence on the final page, and she was thinking about tracks that circled the cabin every night, growing bolder, growing closer, the same pattern Walter himself had described before his own words simply stopped. She looked at Nathan and admitted, quietly, that she did not know what to believe anymore. But whatever was out there, it was learning the cabin, learning its weaknesses, and it was only their second night. 5 more days remained before the storm was expected to break, according to the last weather report either of them had heard before losing signal. 5 more nights of scraping at the door, growling at the windows, tracks circling closer in the dark. Claire did not think she could survive 5 more nights like this one, but looking at the snow falling steadily outside, burying the road deeper with every passing hour, she understood that survival was no longer a choice she got to make on her own terms. It was something she and Nathan would have to figure out together, one long and terrifying night at a time. By the 3rd morning, Claire's ankle had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, the skin stretched tight and shining, streaked with deep purple that had begun creeping up toward her calf. She did not need Nathan to tell her it looked worse. She could feel it in the way the pain no longer stayed contained to one spot, spreading instead in slow, throbbing waves that kept her awake even after exhaustion should have pulled her under. Nathan checked it by the gray morning light, his fingers gentle, but his expression grim. He did not say the word infection, not at first, but Claire saw it forming behind his eyes before he finally spoke it aloud. Without proper treatment, a fracture left untended could break the skin from the inside, could turn septic, could become the kind of injury that no amount of willpower or bravery would be enough to survive on a mountain cut off from any hospital. She asked him, trying to keep her voice steady, what that meant for the days ahead. He was honest with her, more honest than she expected. He said they needed to keep the wound clean, keep her off her feet as much as possible, and hope the swelling responded to rest before infection set in fully. He did not say what would happen if it did not respond. He did not need to. The cabin felt smaller that day, the walls pressing closer, the silence between them heavier than before. Nathan spent the morning searching every cupboard and drawer for anything resembling proper medical supplies, coming up mostly empty except for a bottle of aspirin with a faded label and a roll of gauze that had clearly been sitting unused for years. It was during that search that he found the cellar door, hidden beneath a threadbare rug in the corner of the kitchen, a detail neither of them had noticed in the panic of the first night. A rusted iron ring served as a handle, and when Nathan pulled it, the door groaned open to reveal a narrow set of wooden stairs disappearing into darkness. Claire, hobbling over with the poker still gripped in one hand, out of habit now, peered down into the black space below and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Nathan grabbed the flashlight and told her to wait at the top of the stairs while he checked it out first. She did not wait long before the fear of being alone upstairs outweighed the fear of the dark cellar below, and she made her way down after him, gritting her teeth against the pain in her ankle with every step. The cellar was small, lined with shelves that held old canning jars gone cloudy with age, coils of rope, a rusted set of traps hanging from a hook on the wall. In the far corner, half hidden beneath a stack of empty crates, Nathan's flashlight caught the edge of something that made both of them go very still. It was a rifle, old but well-maintained, leaning against the wall beside a box of ammunition that looked far newer than anything else in the cellar. Beside it, folded neatly, sat a coat, thick and weatherproofed, clearly meant for someone who spent long hours outdoors in brutal cold. Neither item matched the picture forming in Claire's mind of Walter, the cabin's previous occupant whose journal had ended so abruptly. The coat looked barely worn. The ammunition box had a purchase date stamped on the side that was more recent than either of them expected. Nathan crouched down and examined the gun carefully, checking the chamber, running his thumb over a small engraving, near the stock that read only a single initial, the letter G, scratched crudely into the metal. Claire felt her stomach tighten. Whoever G was, they were not Walter, and if someone else had been using this cellar recently enough to leave gear this well maintained, then the mountain outside might be hiding more than just wolves. They carried the rifle and the ammunition upstairs, along with a few of the ropes and traps, deciding that whatever they might need to defend the cabin, it was better in their hands than sitting unused in a cellar that suddenly felt far less abandoned than they had assumed. The rest of the day passed in tense preparation. Nathan checked and rechecked the rifle, testing its action, loading it with careful, deliberate movements, while Claire kept watch at the window, her ankle propped on a stool, the poker never more than an arm's length away. It was nearly dusk when she saw it. A shape at the tree line, upright, moving on 2 legs rather than 4, gone before she could be certain what she had seen. She called Nathan over immediately, her pulse hammering, and together, they stared out at the empty tree line, where the shape had been, snow falling steadily, erasing whatever tracks might have proven she was not imagining things. Nathan asked her, carefully, if she was certain it had not been an animal, a bear perhaps, rearing up on its hind legs the way they sometimes did. Claire wanted to believe that explanation. It would have been so much easier to believe, but something in the way the shape had moved, deliberate and controlled, had looked nothing like an animal reacting to instinct. It had looked like a person watching, deciding, and then choosing to disappear before being seen clearly. That night, the growling around the cabin returned, as it had every night before, circling, testing, prodding at the edges of their shelter. But underneath it, faint and easy to miss if you were not listening for it. Claire heard something else, a rhythm to the growling that felt almost too controlled, almost too patterned, as though something intelligent were directing the animals, rather than simply running alongside them. She mentioned it to Nathan in a whisper, sitting close to the fire with the rifle across his lap, and watched his face go pale in the firelight. He admitted that he had noticed the same thing the past 2 nights, but had convinced himself it was exhaustion playing tricks on his ears. Now, with the rifle in his hands and a rusted trap hanging on a nail nearby with fresh scratches along its metal jaw that had definitely not been there when they carried it upstairs, neither of them could pretend any longer that the danger circling their cabin was simple and animal and easy to understand. Something, or someone, had been living on this mountain long enough to leave gear behind, long enough to know this cabin intimately, long enough perhaps to have been the reason Walter's journal ended the way it did, mid-sentence, mid-thought, with no explanation ever written down. Claire looked at the initials scratched into the rifle stock, the letter G glinting faintly in the firelight, and felt a new kind of fear settle into her chest, one that had nothing to do with wolves, and everything to do with the growing certainty that they were not simply stranded on this mountain. They were being watched, and whoever was watching them had been doing it for far longer than 2 days. The 4th morning brought a strange kind of quiet, the wind dying down just enough that the silence outside felt almost more unsettling than the storm had been. Claire woke to find Nathan already at the window, the rifle resting against the wall beside him, his eyes fixed on the tree line, with an intensity that told her he had not slept at all. He said nothing had come near the cabin during the last few hours before dawn. No growling, no scraping, no shapes moving at the edge of the trees. The quiet should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like something was being planned, a held breath before whatever came next. Claire's ankle had not improved. If anything, the skin around the swelling had taken on a warmth that worried her more than the color had the day before, a heat that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep inside the bone itself. She did not tell Nathan how much worse the pain had become overnight, not because she wanted to hide it, but because she could see the exhaustion already carved into his face, and she did not want to add more weight to shoulders that were already carrying so much. He noticed anyway. He always seemed to notice. He knelt beside her chair, unwrapped the bandage with careful hands, and went very still when he saw what the skin looked like underneath. He did not say the word infection again. He did not have to. His silence said it clearly enough. They spent the morning searching the cabin more thoroughly than before, looking for anything that might help, any hint of who G might be, any clue that might explain the shape Claire had seen at the tree line the evening before. In a drawer beneath the kitchen counter, tucked behind a stack of mismatched silverware, Nathan found a stack of letters, yellowed with age, addressed to someone named Walter, from a man who signed each one simply as his brother. The letters painted a picture neither of them had expected. Walter had not been alone on this mountain during his final winter. His brother, a man the letters referred to only by the initial G, had been staying with him, helping him prepare the cabin for the season, though the tone of the letters shifted somewhere in the middle of the stack, becoming shorter, colder, filled with concern about something the brother would not name directly. The final letter in the stack, dated only weeks before Walter's journal entries trailed off into nothing, contained a single line that made Claire's blood run cold when Nathan read it aloud. It said that G had stopped answering, that Walter feared the mountain had gotten into his brother's head, the way it sometimes did to men who stayed too long in the cold and the silence, and that he did not know what he would do if things did not improve before the snow came in fully. No letters followed after that one. Whatever happened next, between Walter and his brother, on this same mountain, in this same cabin, had never been written down, or if it had, the record had not survived to be found. Claire looked at the rifle, leaning against the wall, at the initial scratched crudely into its stock, and felt the pieces settling into a shape she did not want to see clearly. If G was still alive, if G had spent years alone on this mountain since whatever happened to Walter, then the shape she had glimpsed at the tree line the evening before had not been an animal at all. It had been a man who had lived in this cold and this silence for so long that he no longer resembled the person in those old letters. A man who knew this cabin, who had left gear in its cellar, who circled at night with a patience that suggested he was not hunting blindly, but according to some plan only he understood. Nathan set the rifle across his knees and told Claire, in a low and steady voice, that regardless of who or what was out there, their priority had to remain the same. Keep the fire burning, keep the door secured, keep her ankle from getting any worse until the storm broke enough to reach help. She agreed, though the fear sitting in her chest had grown heavier with every letter they read, every piece of the puzzle clicking into place to form a picture far more unsettling than wolves circling in the dark. That afternoon, while Nathan went out to gather wood, moving faster and more carefully than he had the days before, Claire kept watch from the window, the rifle now resting across her own lap, despite never having fired one in her life. She told herself that holding it made her feel safer. She was not entirely sure that was true. It was during his second trip outside that she saw movement again at the tree line, closer this time, close enough that she could make out the outline of a man standing perfectly still among the pines, watching the cabin with an unnerving patience. She wanted to call out to Nathan, to warn him, but her voice caught in her throat, fear locking her jaw tight, even as her mind screamed at her to do something. By the time she found her voice, Nathan was already turning. Wood gathered in his arms, and the shape at the tree line was gone, vanished so completely into the trees that for one horrible moment, Claire wondered if she had imagined the whole thing. She told him what she had seen the moment he stepped back inside, and watched the color drain further from his already pale face. He set the wood down carefully, checked the rifle, checked the locks on the door for what felt like the 100th time, and told her that starting tonight, they would take turns keeping watch, sleeping in shifts, never both unconscious at the same time again. Claire agreed, though the idea of sleeping at all in a cabin where a man had been watching them from the tree line, a man whose brother's own journal had ended in silence and mystery, felt almost impossible. As the light faded outside and the temperature dropped further, the growling returned right on schedule, circling the cabin with the same patient rhythm as every night before. But this time, underneath the animal sounds, Claire was certain she heard something else. Footsteps in the snow, deliberate and unhurried, crunching closer to the cabin than they had ever come. Nathan positioned himself by the door, rifle ready, while Claire kept watch at the window, poker gripped tight in both hands despite the pain still radiating up from her ankle. Neither of them spoke. Both of them listened, hearts pounding, as the footsteps circled once, twice, and then stopped directly outside the door. For a long, unbearable moment, nothing happened at all. Then a voice came through the wood, rough and unused, as though it had not spoken to another human being in a very long time. It said only a few words, low and strange, asking whether they had found what was in the cellar. Claire's blood ran cold. Nathan's grip on the rifle tightened until his knuckles went white. Whoever stood outside their door knew about the cellar, knew about the rifle, knew, somehow, that they had been down there, which meant he had been watching them far more closely, and for far longer, than either of them had dared to imagine. Neither Claire nor Nathan answered the voice at first. They stood frozen on either side of the small cabin, the rifle trembling slightly in Nathan's grip, the poker clenched so tightly in Claire's hands that her fingers had gone white. The voice outside did not repeat itself immediately. It simply waited, patient in a way that felt far more unsettling than shouting would have been. When it finally spoke again, it asked a second question, quieter this time, wanting to know if Walter's journal had been found as well. There was something almost hopeful in the way the words came out, a strange, broken hopefulness that did not match the fear pounding through Claire's chest. Nathan found his voice before she did. He called out, asking who was there, keeping the rifle aimed steadily at the door, even as his voice shook slightly on the last word. A long silence followed. Then the man outside answered, giving only a single name, Graham. The letters. The initials scratched into the rifle stock. Everything clicked into place at once. This was Walter's brother, the man the letters had described slipping further and further from himself with every passing week of that long-ago winter, the man Walter had feared for in his final entries before the journal went silent. Claire felt a strange mixture of terror and something close to pity settle in her chest. Whatever had happened between the brothers all those years ago, whatever had driven Graham to spend what must have been years alone on this mountain, circling cabins in the dark and speaking to strangers through locked doors, it had clearly cost him more than either of them could fully understand. Nathan asked, carefully, keeping his voice as steady as he could manage, what had happened to Walter? The silence that followed stretched so long that Claire began to wonder if Graham had simply walked away into the storm without answering. Then his voice came again, rougher now, thick with something that sounded uncomfortably close to grief. He said Walter had died that winter, years ago, caught outside during a storm much like this one, while trying to reach the cellar for supplies after their argument had turned physical, an argument Graham refused to explain in any more detail than that. He said he had buried his brother himself, alone, in ground too frozen to dig properly, and had stayed on the mountain ever since because leaving felt like abandoning the only thing he had left of him. Claire's chest tightened with a complicated ache, sympathy tangled together with the very real fear that a man capable of violence toward his own brother, a man who had spent years alone in the wilderness circling cabins in the dark, might not be someone they could trust with their lives. Nathan seemed to be thinking the same thing. He kept the rifle raised and told Graham, firmly but not unkindly, that they meant no harm, that they had only found the cellar by accident while searching for medical supplies, and that all they wanted was to survive the storm and leave the mountain once the roads cleared. Another long silence. Then, unexpectedly, Graham asked if the woman was hurt. He must have seen Claire limping during her trips near the window, must have been close enough, often enough, to notice details neither of them had realized he was tracking. Claire hesitated before answering, but something in the quiet in his voice, some fragile note beneath the roughness, made her decide to be honest. She told him about her ankle, about the swelling that would not go down, about the warmth spreading beneath the skin that worried her more each day. There was a pause, and then Graham said something that neither of them expected. He said there was a proper medical kit in a supply cache half a mile up the ridge, left over from when he used to work with rescue teams before everything fell apart, before the mountain became the only place that made sense to him anymore. He said he could bring it, if they wanted, though he understood, if they did not trust him enough to let him get that close. Nathan and Claire exchanged a long look across the dim firelight, both of them weighing fear against desperation, both of them thinking about the infection creeping beneath Claire's skin, and the days still ahead, before any hope of real rescue. It was Claire who finally spoke, telling Graham, through the door, that they needed the kit, needed it badly, and that if he could bring it without harming either of them, she would be more grateful than she could say. Graham did not answer right away. When he finally did, his voice carried something that sounded almost like relief, as though the offer to help had meant as much to him as the help itself. He said he would return before midnight, and then, without another word, the sound of his footsteps retreated into the storm, swallowed quickly by the wind. For a long time after he left, neither Claire nor Nathan spoke. They simply stood there, hearts still pounding, trying to process the fact that the danger circling their cabin for days was not some faceless predator, but a grieving, broken man who had lost his brother on this very mountain and never found his way back down. Nathan finally lowered the rifle, though he did not set it aside completely, and admitted that he still was not sure whether trusting Graham was the right decision. Claire understood the hesitation. She felt it too, a low hum of uncertainty beneath the fragile hope his offer had sparked. But looking at her ankle, at the heat and swelling that grew worse by the hour, she knew that whatever risk trusting Graham carried, the risk of not getting proper medical supplies, was quickly becoming just as dangerous. They spent the hours until midnight in tense preparation, Nathan keeping watch by the window, while Claire rested her leg as much as possible, both of them straining to hear any sound of Graham's return over the endless howl of the wind. The fire burned low, and more than once, Claire caught herself drifting towards sleep despite the fear, exhaustion finally winning small battles against adrenaline that had been running too high for too many days in a row. It was nearly 1 a.m, later than promised, when a soft knock finally came at the door. 3 careful taps followed by Graham's voice announcing himself before either of them could panic. Nathan opened the door slowly, rifle still ready, and found a man standing in the snow who looked nothing like the monster their imaginations had built over the last few days. Graham was thin, weathered, his beard streaked with gray, his eyes carrying a haunted quality that told its own quiet story about years spent alone with grief, too heavy to put down. In his arms he carried a red medical bag, worn but clearly well maintained, along with a bundle of supplies that included flares, extra rope, and a portable radio unit that made both Claire and Nathan's hearts leap with sudden hope. He set everything down just inside the door, careful not to move too quickly, careful to keep his hands visible at all times, and told them the radio might still reach the ranger station a few miles down the mountain, if the storm allowed enough of a signal through. For the first time since the crash that started this entire ordeal, Claire allowed herself to believe that survival might actually be possible. But as Graham knelt to help clean and properly dress her wound, his hands surprisingly gentle and practiced, she could not shake the feeling that his arrival, however helpful, had opened a new and complicated chapter in a story that was far from finished. Because somewhere out in that storm, among the wolves and the snow and the ghosts of a tragedy years old, there was still the truth of what had really happened to Walter, a truth Graham had not fully told them, and a truth that Claire suspected, watching the flicker of pain cross his face as he worked, was far more complicated than a simple accident during an argument gone wrong. Graham stayed until dawn, sitting near the door rather than the fire, as though he did not feel he had earned the right to sit closer. He explained, in halting sentences, how the radio worked, showing Nathan the correct frequency for the ranger station, and warning him that the signal would likely only punch through during brief lulls in the storm, if at all. He also warned them, more seriously than anything else he had said that night, that the wolves circling the cabin were not the only reason he had wanted them to stay locked inside after dark. When Claire asked what he meant, his expression grew distant, and he admitted, quietly, that he was not always in control of himself out here anymore. That there had been nights, especially in the deep cold of winter, when grief and isolation blurred together into something he did not fully trust himself to navigate. He said he had been watching the cabin, not only out of curiosity about the strangers who had arrived, but because some instinct in him, some fragment of the man he used to be before the mountain took the rest, had refused to let harm come to anyone else on this land, not after what happened to his brother. It was not a full explanation. It was not even a comfortable one. But it was honest, and Claire found herself believing him more than she expected to, even as a small, cautious part of her mind reminded her that grief and instability could just as easily turn dangerous as protective, and that trusting a stranger this quickly, on a mountain that had already proven how easily things could go wrong, was its own kind of risk. Graham left just before sunrise, promising to check on them again that evening, and disappeared back into the tree line with the same quiet efficiency he had arrived with. Nathan bolted the door behind him and turned to find Claire staring at the radio, her hands trembling slightly as she turned the dial exactly the way Graham had shown her. For nearly an hour, they took turns trying different frequencies, catching only static and the occasional garbled fragment of a voice too distorted to understand. Then, just as Claire was about to give up, a burst of clearer sound crackled through, a ranger's voice announcing the station identification, before dissolving back into noise. Nathan grabbed the radio and spoke quickly, giving their location as best he could remember from the drive up, explaining the crash, the storm, Claire's worsening injury. The response that came back was broken, half swallowed by static, but the words that did come through were enough to make both of them nearly collapse with relief. A rescue team would attempt to reach them once the worst of the storm passed, likely within the next 2 days, weather permitting. 2 days. It felt like nothing compared to the endless stretch of nights they had already survived, and yet it also felt impossibly far away, considering how much worse Claire's ankle had grown, considering the wolves still circling every night, considering that somewhere out in the storm, a grieving, unstable man now knew exactly where they were and exactly how vulnerable they had become. That evening, true to his word, Graham returned, this time bringing dried meat and a thermos of something warm that smelled faintly of pine needles and unfamiliar herbs. He checked Claire's ankle again, his expression tightening at what he saw, and admitted that the infection was progressing faster than he had hoped, that the antibiotics in the medical kit might not be strong enough to fully stop it without proper hospital care. Nathan asked him directly, this time, what exactly had happened to Walter, pressing past the vague explanation from the night before. Graham was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire, before he finally answered. He said the argument that night, all those years ago, had started over something small, a disagreement about supplies, about whose responsibility it was to check the traps before the storm rolled in. It had escalated faster than either of them expected, years of buried resentment and isolation, finally boiling over into something neither brother could control. Graham admitted, his voice breaking slightly, that he had pushed Walter during the fight, harder than he meant to. and that Walter had fallen, striking his head against the stone hearth before stumbling outside in confusion and rage, refusing to let Graham help him. By the time Graham found him again, hours later, the storm had already claimed him. The confession hung heavy in the small cabin, the fire crackling in the silence that followed. Claire watched Graham's face carefully, watched the genuine devastation carved into every line of it, and felt the last of her fear toward him settle into something closer to sorrow. Whatever Graham had become out here, however unsettling his presence at their door had first seemed, the man in front of her now was clearly someone who had spent years punishing himself for a mistake he could never take back. Nathan, however, remained more guarded, watching Graham with the careful eyes of someone who had heard a confession, but was still weighing how much of it to trust completely. He asked, carefully, whether Graham had ever considered leaving the mountain, seeking help, finding some way back to the life he had before. Graham's answer was simple and final. He said the mountain was the only place he had left where Walter's memory still felt close enough to touch. Leaving would mean losing that too. The conversation drifted into a heavier silence after that, none of them quite sure what to say next. It was Claire, finally, who asked the question that had been sitting uneasily in the back of her mind since the confession began. She asked whether the wolves circling the cabin every night had anything to do with Graham, whether he had somehow been directing them, or whether their presence was simply an unfortunate coincidence, layered on top of an already dangerous situation. Graham's expression shifted at the question, something uneasy passing behind his eyes. He admitted, reluctantly, that the wolf pack on this stretch of mountain had grown used to his presence over the years, had learned to follow him during his rounds, drawn perhaps by the food scraps he sometimes left behind without meaning to. He said he had tried to keep them away from the cabin during their stay, but the storm had pushed the pack more aggressive and more desperate than usual, and there was only so much influence one man could have over animals driven by hunger and instinct. It was not the reassurance either of them had hoped for. If anything, it deepened the unease settling over the cabin, the realization that even with Graham's help, even with the radio and the promise of rescue in 2 days, the danger circling them at night remained just as real and just as unpredictable as it had been from the very beginning. As Graham prepared to leave again before midnight, he paused at the door and told them something that made both Claire and Nathan go very still. He said the storm was expected to worsen before it broke, a final surge moving in from the north that could bring heavier snow than anything they had seen so far, potentially destabilizing the ridge above the cabin, a ridge that had a history of shifting under enough weight and pressure. Nathan asked what that meant, though some part of him clearly already suspected the answer. Graham said it plainly. If the snow built up too much on that ridge, and the temperature shifted even slightly, there was a real risk of an avalanche, one that could come down directly over the cabin with little to no warning. The words settled over the room like a physical weight. 2 more days until rescue. An infection, creeping steadily through Claire's leg. Wolves circling every night, hungry and unpredictable. And now, hanging over everything else, the possibility that the very mountain sheltering them might soon try to bury them alive. Graham disappeared into the storm once more, promising to return with any updates he could gather from higher on the ridge. Claire and Nathan sat together by the dwindling fire, the weight of everything they now knew pressing down on both of them in heavy, exhausted silence. 2 days no longer felt like a countdown to safety. It felt like a race against a mountain that had already claimed one life on this very spot, and showed no sign of being finished collecting what it believed it was still owed. Sleep did not come easily that night, though exhaustion pulled at both of them with a heaviness neither could fully resist. Claire drifted in and out, her ankle throbbing in time with her pulse, her mind replaying Graham's warning about the ridge over and over, until the fear of an avalanche blurred together with the fear of infection and the fear of wolves into one constant, humming dread that never fully let her rest. At some point in the deep hours before dawn, she woke to find Nathan sitting beside her chair, rather than across the room, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, even through the blankets. He had not meant to wake her, he said quietly when she stirred. He had simply wanted to be near enough to hear if her breathing changed, if the fever Graham warned them about finally set in. She realized in that quiet moment how much had shifted between them in just a handful of days. The stranger who had answered the door with an axe raised in fear had become someone who sat awake through the night watching over her, Someone whose voice had grown steadier and more certain with every crisis they faced together, even as the world outside grew more dangerous by the hour. She did not say any of this out loud. There was no room yet for that kind of honesty, not with a mountain threatening to bury them and an infection creeping through her leg. But she let herself lean, just slightly, into the warmth beside her, and for the first time since the crash, she felt something other than pure fear settle into her chest. Morning brought harsher wind than any they had experienced so far, the storm gathering the strength Graham had warned them about, snow driving nearly sideways past the window in thick, blinding sheets. Nathan tried the radio twice, catching nothing but static both times, the worsening weather apparently swallowing even the brief window of signal they had managed the day before. By midday, Claire's fever had risen enough that Nathan grew visibly frightened, pressing a hand to her forehead again and again, as though checking might somehow will the heat away. She tried to reassure him, tried to joke weakly about needing more blankets rather than more worry, but the effort left her breathless, in a way that scared them both more than either wanted to admit. It was Graham who arrived earlier than expected that afternoon, his face grim beneath a fresh layer of frost, urgency replacing the careful calm he had carried the nights before. He said the snow on the ridge had built faster than he anticipated, that cracks were already forming along sections he had monitored for years, without ever seeing them shift this dramatically. He said, plainly, that waiting 2 full days for rescue was no longer safe. If the ridge let go, the cabin sat directly in its path, and no amount of sturdy walls would protect them from that kind of force. Nathan asked what alternative they had, voice tight with barely controlled panic. Graham explained that there was an old ranger outpost roughly 2 miles down a service trail, sturdier, positioned well outside the avalanche path, stocked with emergency supplies, and a radio far more powerful than the small handheld unit they currently possessed. It would mean leaving the cabin immediately, trekking through the worst of the storm, with Claire's ankle in the state it was in, and the wolves still in unpredictable danger somewhere in the white and howling world outside. Claire felt fear claw up her throat at the thought of moving at all, let alone trekking 2 miles through a blizzard on a leg that could barely hold her weight even standing still. But staying meant risking the ridge, risking the fever climbing higher with every hour, risking everything on the hope that the storm and the snow and the danger circling them would somehow hold off long enough for a rescue that might not even reach them in time. There was no good option left. Only degrees of danger and the desperate hope that the one they chose would be survivable. Nathan made the decision quickly, the way he seemed to make every important decision since the crash, with a steadiness that Claire had come to rely on more than she expected to. They would leave for the outpost immediately, before the storm worsened further, before the fever climbing through Claire's body robbed her of the strength she would need for the journey ahead. Graham helped fashion a makeshift sled from the cabin's old wooden table, padding it with blankets, rigging a rope harness that he and Nathan could use to pull it through the deep snow. Claire protested weakly, insisting she could walk with support, but one look at her ankle, swollen and hot beneath the bandages, was enough to end the argument before it truly began. They bundled her as warmly as the cabin's remaining supplies allowed, packed what food and medical items they could carry, and stepped out into a storm so fierce that the world beyond the porch disappeared into an endless churning white within seconds. The trek began in near silence, both men focused entirely on pulling the sled through drifts that in places reached past their knees, wind screaming so loudly that conversation became nearly impossible. Claire gripped the edges of the sled, teeth chattering despite the layers of blankets, watching the cabin disappear behind them into the storm, and feeling a strange grief at leaving behind the only shelter that had kept them alive this long. They had covered perhaps half a mile when the growling returned, closer and more numerous than any night before, the storm apparently emboldening the wolf pack rather than driving it to shelter. Graham stopped abruptly, raising a hand for silence, his eyes scanning the swirling white for any sign of movement. It came from 3 directions at once, dark shapes materializing out of the blizzard with terrifying speed, the pack having clearly tracked their scent the moment they left the relative safety of the cabin walls. Nathan dropped the sled rope and raised the rifle, Graham drawing a long hunting knife from his belt, both men positioning themselves protectively around Claire as the wolves circled closer, teeth bared, eyes catching what little light existed in the storm with an eerie, predatory gleam. The first wolf lunged before either man could react fully, and the following moments dissolved into chaos, a blur of snarling and shouting, and the deafening crack of the rifle, firing once, twice, into the swirling white. Claire screamed as one of the shapes broke past Nathan's guard, coming close enough that she could see its yellowed teeth before Graham's knife found its mark, driving the animal back with a pained yelp that sent it retreating into the storm. For several terrifying minutes, the fight raged around the sled, both men fighting with everything they had, while Claire could do nothing but watch, helpless, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might give out before the wolves ever reached her. Then, as suddenly as it began, the pack broke off, retreating into the whiteout as quickly as they had appeared, whether from the rifle fire or simple calculation that the prey had proven too costly to pursue further. Nathan collapsed to his knees beside the sled, breathing hard, a shallow gash across his forearm bleeding freely into the snow. Graham checked him quickly, declared the wound survivable if treated soon, and urged them both to keep moving before the pack regrouped for another attempt. They pressed on through the storm, exhaustion and fear and pain blending together into something almost unreal, the outpost feeling impossibly far away, even as Graham insisted they were close. Claire watched Nathan's face, pale and set with determination, despite the blood soaking through the makeshift bandage on his arm, and felt something fierce and protective rise up inside her chest, a feeling far too large and far too complicated to examine in the middle of a fight for survival. Whatever this storm, this mountain, and this string of impossible days had done to them, she understood now, with sudden and startling clarity, that she did not simply want to survive alongside Nathan Hale. She wanted a life afterward that included him in it. The final stretch to the outpost felt endless, the storm showing no mercy as they pushed forward, Graham breaking trail, while Nathan pulled the sled with an arm that had to be burning with pain beneath the makeshift bandage. Claire tried to help however she could, calling out directions when Graham's flashlight beam caught landmarks he described from memory, though her fever made even that small task increasingly difficult as her thoughts began to blur at the edges. When the outpost finally appeared through the swirling white, a low, sturdy building built into the side of the mountain itself, all three of them nearly collapsed with relief. Graham forced the door open against a stubborn lock, and the warmth of the interior, stale and cold as it was compared to a lit fire, still felt like the greatest comfort Claire had experienced in days. Inside, exactly as Graham promised, sat a radio unit, far more powerful than the small handheld device from the cabin, along with emergency supplies, blankets, and a small wood stove that Nathan got working with hands that shook from cold and exhaustion in equal measure. Graham immediately set to work on the radio, adjusting dials with the ease of someone who had done this many times before, while Nathan helped Claire onto a cot near the stove, checking her ankle again, with visible worry at how much worse the fever had grown during their trek. It took nearly 20 minutes of adjusting frequencies before Graham finally caught a clear signal, the ranger station's voice coming through crisp and unmistakable for the first time since this entire ordeal began. He explained their situation quickly, the crash, the injury, the avalanche risk at the original cabin, their current location at the outpost. The response, when it came, brought the first wave of real, unguarded relief any of them had felt in days. A rescue helicopter would attempt to reach them as soon as there was even a brief break in the storm, potentially within hours rather than days, given the outpost's clearer landing area compared to the cabin's dense tree cover. Claire felt tears sting her eyes at the news, exhaustion and relief tangling together, until she could not tell which emotion was making her cry. Nathan knelt beside the cot, taking her hand in his own eyes bright with the same overwhelming relief, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, simply holding on to each other in the aftermath of everything they had survived together. Graham busied himself checking supplies and monitoring the radio, giving them a strange, tactful privacy despite the small space, though Claire caught him glancing their way more than once with an expression that looked almost wistful, as though watching something he had once had and lost long ago. The hours that followed passed in a haze of waiting, the storm outside gradually beginning to lose some of its fury as the promised break in weather crept slowly closer. Nathan stayed close to Claire's side the entire time, tending the stove, checking her fever, occasionally exchanging quiet words with Graham about the storm's progress, or the likelihood of the helicopter making it through before nightfall. At one point, while Graham stepped outside briefly to check visibility, Claire found herself alone with Nathan for the first time since the chaos of the wolf attack, the quiet of the outpost settling around them like something almost peaceful compared to everything they had just survived. She looked at him, at the exhaustion and worry still etched into his face despite the good news, and found herself thinking again about the promise she had made him swear, half joking, half serious, back on that very first strange and terrifying night. She had told him not to fall in love with her. She realized now, watching him carefully redress the wound on his own arm without complaint, that she had broken that promise herself, somewhere between the wolves and the storm, and the quiet, steady way he had cared for her through every terrifying moment since. She did not say any of this aloud, not yet, not with Graham still nearby, and the danger of the mountain not fully behind them, but she let herself hold his hand a little longer than necessary, let herself lean into the warmth of him by the small stove, and felt something settle inside her chest that had nothing to do with fear at all. It was nearly dusk when Graham returned from outside, his expression carrying a new urgency that made both Claire and Nathan sit up straighter despite their exhaustion. He said the storm had broken enough that a helicopter might actually reach them within the hour, but he had also spotted something on his way back to the outpost that worried him. Fresh cracks along the ridge near the original cabin, visible even through the thinning snowfall, wider and more numerous than what he had seen the day before. He said, quietly, that leaving the cabin when they did had likely saved their lives. The ridge looked closer than ever to letting go completely. As if summoned by his words, a low rumble reached them through the walls of the outpost minutes later, distant but unmistakable, followed by a tremor that rattled the windows and sent a fine dust of snow sliding off the roof outside. Graham rushed to the door, throwing it open despite the cold, and stared up toward the direction of the original cabin, with an expression that shifted from concern to something like grim vindication. The ridge had let go. Somewhere back through the trees, buried now beneath tons of shifting snow, the small cabin that had sheltered them through the worst of this ordeal, the cabin where Walter had lived and died, and where Graham had spent years circling in grief, no longer existed in any recognizable form. Claire felt a strange, hollow ache at the thought, even knowing how close they had come to being buried alongside it. Nathan wrapped an arm around her shoulders, steady and warm, and together they watched Graham stand in the doorway for a long moment, staring at the place where his brother's memory had lived for so many years, now gone in an instant beneath the weight of the mountain he had never been able to leave. When he finally turned back to them, his eyes were wet, though his voice remained steady, as he said that perhaps it was time, after everything, for him to leave the mountain as well. The distant thrum of helicopter blades cut through the wind moments later, growing steadily louder, and all three of them stepped outside into the clearing, faces turned toward the sky, watching for the first sign of the rescue that would finally carry them away from a mountain that had taken so much and, somehow, in the end, had given something back as well. The helicopter descended slowly through the last of the thinning snowfall, its spotlight sweeping across the clearing, before settling on the small group waiting below. Claire had never in her life felt as much relief as she did watching those landing skids touch down, snow scattering outward in a wide circle from the force of the rotors. Two paramedics jumped out before the blades had even fully slowed, rushing toward them with equipment bags slung over their shoulders, shouting questions over the noise that Claire could barely process through the haze of fever and exhaustion pulling at the edges of her awareness. They lifted her carefully onto a stretcher, checking her vitals with quick, practiced hands, one of them frowning deeply at the heat radiating from her ankle, and the rapid, thready pulse that told its own story, about how close the infection had come, to turning into something far more dangerous. Nathan stayed close beside her the entire time, refusing to let go of her hand, even as the paramedics worked, only stepping back when they insisted they needed room to secure her properly for the flight. Graham helped load her into the helicopter, his weathered face unreadable in the harsh light, and it was only as the paramedics turned their attention to treating the gash on Nathan's arm that Claire realized Graham was not moving to climb aboard with them. She called out to him over the roar of the blades, panic rising sharply at the thought of leaving him behind after everything he had done to save their lives. He shook his head, stepping back from the helicopter's downdraft, and told her, in a voice just loud enough to carry, that there were things on this mountain he still needed to settle, places he needed to visit one last time, now that the cabin and everything it held was finally gone. Nathan argued with him briefly, insisting he come along, that whatever needed settling could wait until he had been properly checked over by medical staff as well. But Graham simply shook his head again, a small, tired smile crossing his face for the first time since they had met him, and said he would come down the mountain on his own terms, when he was ready, not carried out by a helicopter like something rescued against his will. He promised, however, looking directly at Claire with an intensity that told her he meant it, that he would make his way to the ranger station within the week, that the years of hiding on this mountain had finally reached their end, regardless of how he chose to leave it. The ridge taking the cabin, he said, felt like the mountain itself finally letting go of what it had been holding on to for so long. He intended to do the same. There was no time to argue further. The paramedics needed to get airborne before the weather shifted again, and Claire, exhausted and fevered and overwhelmed by everything that had happened, found herself unable to do anything but watch through the window, as Graham grew smaller and smaller against the vast white mountain below, a solitary figure standing where the storm had finally begun to clear, watching them go. The flight to the hospital passed in a blur for Claire, fever and exhaustion pulling her in and out of full awareness, though she remained conscious enough to feel Nathan's hand gripping hers the entire way, steady and warm despite his own injuries. She caught fragments of conversation between the paramedics, words like severe infection and possible sepsis risk that frightened her even through the fog clouding her thoughts. But every time panic threatened to rise, she focused instead on the pressure of Nathan's hand, on the steady sound of his voice, murmuring reassurances she could not always fully hear, but could always feel. At the hospital, everything moved quickly once they arrived. Nurses and doctors surrounding her stretcher the moment the helicopter touched down, wheeling her away for treatment that involved IV antibiotics and careful monitoring meant to catch the infection before it could spread any further into her bloodstream. Nathan was taken in a different direction to have his own wound properly cleaned and stitched, though not before he pressed a quick kiss to her forehead and promised he would be right there the moment the doctors allowed it. The following hours blurred together in a haze of medication and exhausted sleep, fever finally beginning to break under the careful treatment of doctors who assured her, again and again, that she had reached help just in time, that a few more hours untreated might have told a very different story. When she finally woke fully, clear-headed for the first time in what felt like an eternity, sunlight was streaming through the hospital window, and Nathan was sitting in a chair pulled close to her bed, his arm properly bandaged, dark circles under his eyes that told her he had not left her side for very long, if at all. He smiled the moment he saw her eyes open, relief flooding his expression so completely that Claire felt her own eyes fill with tears at the sight of it. He told her the fever had broken overnight, that the doctors were optimistic about a full recovery, though her ankle would need a proper cast, and weeks of careful healing once the swelling went down enough for accurate imaging. Weeks of healing sounded, after everything they had survived, like the easiest problem in the world. Claire reached for his hand, and he took it immediately, lacing his fingers through hers with a familiarity that felt like it had been built over years rather than a handful of terrifying days. She thought about the promise she had made him swear that very first night, sitting by the fire in a cabin that no longer existed, buried now beneath tons of snow on a mountain neither of them would ever forget. She told him, quietly, that she owed him an apology. Confused, he asked what for. She reminded him of the promise, the rule she had insisted on so firmly that first strange night, and admitted, with a small, tired laugh, that she had broken it herself, long before either of them ever admitted anything out loud. Nathan's expression softened into something warm and unguarded, and he told her, gently, that he had broken it even earlier than she had, sometime around the second night, watching her fall asleep in that chair by the fire, despite everything trying to keep either of them from resting easy. The confession, so simple after everything they had endured, felt like the first truly peaceful moment either of them had experienced since the crash that started this entire ordeal. Outside the hospital window, the sky stretched clear and blue, an almost cruel contrast to the storm that had nearly taken everything from them just days before. Claire squeezed his hand, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, allowed herself to imagine a future that did not feel uncertain or frightening at all. Recovery took longer than either of them expected, 3 weeks in a cast, followed by months of careful physical therapy, to rebuild the strength in an ankle that had come far closer to permanent damage than Claire liked to think about. Nathan stayed close through all of it, not because anyone asked him to, but because neither of them could imagine it any other way after the 7 days that had changed everything between them. He drove her to every appointment, sat with her through the frustrating early sessions when walking without pain felt impossibly far away, and celebrated with a quiet, fierce pride the day she finally managed a full lap around the therapy room without leaning on anything at all. Somewhere in those slow, ordinary months, the intensity of the mountain faded into something steadier, something built not on fear and adrenaline, but on the simple daily choice to keep showing up for each other. They spoke often about Graham during those early weeks, both of them anxious for news, both relieved beyond words when a call finally came from the ranger station, confirming that he had walked down from the mountain exactly as he promised, turning himself in to face whatever consequences remained from an accident buried under years of silence and grief. The investigation that followed was complicated, painful, filled with details about Walter's death that none of them ever fully learned, but in the end, the ranger who called Claire personally to update her explained that Graham's cooperation, his years of quiet penance on that mountain, and the genuine role he had played in saving both her life and Nathan's, weighed heavily in his favor. He would face consequences, certainly, but not the kind that would erase the rest of his life entirely. Claire found herself relieved by that outcome, in a way that surprised her, given how terrifying his presence outside their cabin door had once seemed. People, she had learned on that mountain, were rarely as simple as the fear in a single moment made them look. Nathan's business, the one that had collapsed so completely before he ever set foot on that cabin's porch, found an unexpected second chance, not long after they returned to ordinary life. A former client, hearing through mutual connections about the ordeal he had survived, reached out with an offer to help rebuild what had been lost, moved as much by the story of his survival as by the quality of work he had always been known for before everything fell apart. Nathan accepted cautiously at first, still wary after being burned once already, but slowly, carefully, began piecing his career back together with a steadiness that mirrored everything else rebuilding in his life. Claire, for her part, found that the divorce she had once believed defined the worst chapter of her life had quietly shrunk into something manageable, something she could finally look back on without the sharp, constant ache that had sent her running toward a mountain cabin in the first place. In its place stood something she had never expected to find at all, certainly not in the middle of a blizzard, certainly not with a stranger who had answered the door holding an axe. It was nearly a year later, on a clear autumn afternoon with no storm clouds anywhere on the horizon, that Nathan suggested they take a drive up into the mountains, not toward the same road, not anywhere near the site of the avalanche that had buried the cabin and everything inside it, but simply somewhere quiet, somewhere they could sit together and watch the leaves turning colors along the ridgelines. They stopped at an overlook with a clear view of the distant peaks, snow already beginning to dust the highest points, even though the valley below still held on to the last warmth of the season. Claire leaned against the railing, breathing in air that smelled like pine and cold stone, and thought about how different this mountain air felt now, compared to the terror she had once associated with it. Nathan stood beside her for a long moment before he spoke, his voice quieter than usual, carrying a note of nervousness that immediately caught her attention. He reminded her, gently, of the promise she had made him swear that very first night, sitting by a fire in a cabin neither of them had ever expected to share. He reminded her how thoroughly they had both broken it, long before either of them found the courage to say so out loud. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box, and Claire understood, with a rush of emotion so overwhelming it stole the breath right out of her lungs, exactly what he was about to ask. He told her that he did not want to make her any more promises about not falling in love, because he intended to spend the rest of his life proving just how completely he already had. He asked her, simply and honestly, if she would marry him, if she would let the rest of their story be one they built together, far away from storms and cabins and mountains that tried to take everything from them. Claire said yes before he had even fully finished the question, laughing through tears that came just as easily as the ones that had fallen in that hospital room nearly a year before, though these carried nothing but joy in them now. They stood together at that overlook for a long time afterward, the mountain range stretching out before them in the golden autumn light, no longer a place of fear and survival, but simply a beautiful, quiet backdrop to a moment neither of them would ever forget. Somewhere far beyond those peaks, Buried now under a permanent blanket of snow, the remains of a small cabin rested where an avalanche had claimed it, along with the ghosts of a tragedy that had haunted that mountain for years before Claire and Nathan ever arrived. But standing at that overlook, hand in hand, neither of them thought of that cabin as a place of loss any longer. It had been, in its own strange and terrifying way, the place where their real story began. 7 days that nearly ended everything had instead given them a beginning neither of them could have imagined walking into that storm. A beginning built on trust, forged in fear, on care shown through the darkest nights, and on a promise neither of them had ever truly intended to keep. They drove back down the mountain as the sun began to set, the ring catching the last light on Claire's hand, both of them quiet and content, in a way that only came from having survived something enormous together, and finding, on the other side of it, exactly the life they did not know they were searching for. The storm had taken so much from that mountain over the years, but for Claire Bennett and Nathan Hale, it had also given something back, something neither of them would ever stop being grateful for as long as they lived.